Hello, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you're located. We just want to welcome you. We are really excited for this discussion today. We're here to support communities who are expanding their first response efforts. The Council of State Governments Justice Center launched a groundbreaking toolkit called Expanding First Response, a toolkit for community responder programs as a central resource hub for communities and states in 2021. And we have been continuing to build on that to kind of offer tips and strategies that communities can use when they're seeking to expand their current first response options. In recognizing this kind of need for additional information, we really thought about how can we elevate the voices of people in the community and in leadership roles who are doing this work nationally. So we decided to get together a commission, which is first of its kind nationally, focused on community response. And we started this in 2023. There's 21 members representing a diverse cross-section of community responder programs, researchers, advocates, policymakers nationwide. And collectively, these experts who know the current and realistic landscape for expanding these first response options really well have been helping us to use practice-based evidence to identify emerging practices for professionals interested in uplifting and expanding community response. Last year, the commission met through Zoom over a 6-month period. So that allowed us to get people from everywhere throughout the country to be able to participate on this. Rural, urban, many different states represented. The CSG Justice Center and guest speakers helped facilitate these meetings. During and after the meetings, we worked closely with the commission members to outline the emerging practices, but also sought to document the processes and establishing and engaging the commission to help communities replicate this locally. We have a forthcoming report, which is going to be called Expanding First Response National Commission, and it's going to highlight some of these emerging practices that we discussed as part of these meetings. It's really meant to elevate opportunities for people to replicate this in communities nationwide. On this webinar today, we're really excited to be joined by 6 of those commission members from the National Commission. And our purpose here is really just to make sure everyone knows what the Expanding First Response Commission is and who was a part of it, to help understand why the commission was essential for this and other work, and how these strategies can be utilized different in different communities, but the connections across can be super helpful to elevating this work. Learning how to build and facilitate a coalition to sustain this type of work at all levels, so state, local, really community-based work. See examples of the results of what has worked. So the folks on the line have done a lot of this thinking and work and are just sharing some ideas on strategies that have worked for them in their efforts to expand first response. And ideally, we really want to walk away with everybody inspired to build community responder programs with people from various identities and experience, to partner with community and program decision-making, to add your voice, your experience, your perspective to the existing conversation, and to really create a meaningful conversation in your community locally, and to think about how we can collaborate on setting some practice ideas into motion. So as I mentioned, today we have 6 of the 21 commission members, and we're really excited for them to share their experience, their knowledge, and the amazing work that they've done at the state level and locally in their communities.
Thanks, Sarah. And hello, commission members. We are thrilled that you are here today. So we're going to kick off today's conversation with each of you introducing yourselves, what you do, why you joined the commission, and also why you stayed engaged with this process. So Tansy, would you kick us off?
Sure thing. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Tansy McNulty. I'm the founder and CEO of 1 Million Madly Motivated Moms. And since that's a mouthful, right, we go by 1M4 for short. And we're a collective of Black women, Black maternal figures, and our allies across the country who are working every day of our lives to end police violence in this country by the year 2038. And so you're probably like, why are you in this space, right? Why are we here? A couple years ago, we put together one of the first directories for crisis response, community response across the country. It was released in July of 2021 during Minority Mental Health Month, and it provided people with over 150 response teams across the country who you can call when there's a mental health or behavioral health or substance use disorder emergency. So why did we do this? So we did this because a large portion of our work to in police violence is to decriminalize mental illness and move people from a criminalized or a carceral response to a care and a health-centered response. So we just 2 months ago released our latest iteration of that same directory. We have finally named the directory. It has a formal name now as The Right Response, and you can find it at therightresponse.co. And it has over 250 mobile crisis, co-response, and community response units across the country. So who am I? I'm a founder, I'm a community member, but more than anything, I'm simply just a mom who's working to create a safer nation for her children. And I will pass it over to Chief Holloway.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. My name's Tony Holloway. I'm the Chief of Police in St. Petersburg, Florida. We are the 5th largest city in Florida. I've been involved in law enforcement for over 39 years. Of those 39 years, I spent 17 years as a police chief. I've been here in St. Pete for 9.5 years here. Prior to that was Clearwater. Prior to that was a city called Somerville in Massachusetts. The reason why I'm part of the commission is to learn and develop new programs so law enforcement can work with the community on how we should respond to non-criminal calls when someone's going through a mental crisis or something, again, that is something that's non-criminal. How do we take law enforcement out of the picture and how do we bring the community into the picture and how we can work together? So that's why I'm engaging in this commission, because I want to continue to learn. We're a very progressive police department. And again, how do we continue to work together, law enforcement and the community? So thank you for having me.
Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Annie Burwell. I'm with the Round Rock Fire Department in Round Rock, Texas, which is just north of Austin. Our community runs a flex-based response for 911 calls related to substance use or crisis or mental illness, meaning we send either a team of behavioral health clinicians or a clinician and a paramedic, or if the situation has some known violence, then we will partner with police. So we're a strong believer that crisis and mental illness and substance use is generally a medical issue with occasional symptoms of violence. And so we want to provide the most appropriate response for whatever's happening in the community so that everyone leaves safely and getting the resources that they need. I joined the commission in order to learn more about what's going on around the country so that our community stays up to date and current on what we're doing and continuing to stretch our skills. And I'm a strong believer in bringing these sorts of responses to more rural and suburban areas. We're not really hitting stride in those areas as quickly as we are in some of our urban communities. So that's me, and thank you for having me here today. And I believe, let's see who's next. Reverend Boyer.
Thank you. Thank you, Annie. I'm Charles Boyer. I pastor Greater Mount Zion AME Church in Trenton, New Jersey. It's the oldest Black church in the city, started as Free African Society. I also am a co-founder of an organization called Salvation and Social Justice, a Black faith-rooted public policy organization and direct impact organization. Got involved in all of this starting back in 2018. New Jersey Advanced Media released a report that showed excessive use of force by New Jersey police departments upon Black communities. We held hearings in Black churches all across the state to hear from folks directly impacted by police violence. And overwhelmingly, those folks wanted a different response rather than a forceful response. In response to that, we created a campaign called Make the Right Call, which you can visit callnj.org, and where we advocated for policy that would have community-led first response, and it's in non-violent issues surrounding mental health, substance use issues, quality of life issues. In that same time, we launched a community-based violence intervention organization in the city of Trenton called the Trenton Restorative Street Team. All of that work came together to build that we advocated for to appropriate $12 million in cities across the state for community-led first response teams, which would grow out of community-based violence intervention teams. Was signed into law just last month by Governor Murphy, the Seabrooks, Washington bill, named after two young men who were killed in mental health crises by police. And so I joined the commission, one, to learn from folks who have this work implemented and on the ground, to be in a constant conversation around standards and protocols, to learn best practices and to share and to learn and to coordinate. And I will pass it to Carlos.
Thank you, Reverend. I really appreciate it. Hello, everybody. My name is Carlos Sosa. I'm the director of the Department of Community Resilience at the City of New Haven. The mission of my department is to invest in partnerships, advancing equitable community-based approaches that create socioeconomic opportunities for our most vulnerable residents while dismantling structural racism and promoting healing from trauma and exposure to violence. In that sense, I oversee an Office of Housing and Homeless Services, an Office of Community Mental Health Initiatives, an Office of Violence Prevention. Collectively, I oversee over 75 services and programs that address issues faced by our most vulnerable residents, including people who are unhoused, people returning from incarceration, people who are in crisis, people who use drugs, people at the risk of being involved in gun violence, victims of gun violence, and their families. One of the services that I oversee within the portfolio is MCD Campus, our community responder program. MCD Campus came about due to pressures from community members to better address mental health crises and quality of life issues related to substance use, mental illness, and homelessness. They were asking something very fair. They were asking for the right type of response with the right skill sets and at the right time. In my previous life, prior to joining the City of New Haven, I was a community organizer. I came into government with almost 10 years of experience organizing and empowering communities. So as a trained organizer, I basically taught communities how to advocate for themselves. This experience helped me understand the importance of engaging communities when creating complex solutions, such as a community responder program. I joined the commission because when I first started working on the New Haven Community Responder Program, I couldn't find many resources. There were a few articles here and there, but not a toolkit like the one we co-designed here. I stayed engaged with the commission because it is so important that other jurisdictions can access a knowledge base, a toolkit in this case, to guide their work. I really wish I had something similar when I started doing this work, and I thank the Council of State Governments for putting together this commission, for doing the work that you're doing, and for the opportunity to be here to share my experience. Thank you. And I will pass it on to Mark.
Thank you, Carlos. So my name is Mark Gale. I'm a 20-year NAMI member. NAMI is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and I volunteer as Criminal Justice Chair with NAMI Greater Los Angeles County. After really many, many years of resistance to reform in LA, things began to change in 2015 when then District Attorney Jackie Lacey convened the entire county's criminal justice system in a criminal justice mental health task force And it was determined that one of the things that we needed to do very desperately is expand CIT, crisis intervention team training, within the Sheriff's Department. Due to a court decision and Department of Justice consent decree that mandated training for Los Angeles Sheriff's Department sheriff deputies and custody assistants, NAMI GLAC was asked to participate in a very big way in the CIT training. The schedule called for 10 to 12 CIT presentations every single month. And then Executive Director Brittany Weissman and myself realized that we had to put together a very large workforce to do all these trainings. We drafted a training program. It spent 6 months on it. It was a 6-hour in-person presentation. We trained over 100 volunteers, excuse me, to participate in CIT classes for both LASD custody and patrol, and many of our independent police departments. And this went on for years. We've now presented to over 8,000 sworn officers. We didn't think it was right to send NAMI volunteers into probably the toughest class in the world, which is 24 to 30 law enforcement officers with their arms folded, looking at our presenters, that they needed some help and preparation. So we developed our own presenter training course. We sold the idea to NAMI National, and it was adapted by NAMI National for a nationwide rollout in an online format called Sharing Your Story with Law Enforcement, or you'll hear the acronym Sicily. That led to advocating at the county level for the Board of Supervisors to increase funding for alternative crisis response. We've had a large part in letting our perspectives be known. And this goes for CIT law enforcement response, a law enforcement mental health partnership, such as co-response teams, like our LAPD SMART or our Sheriff's Met teams, and also a complete non-law enforcement clinical peer response, such as psychiatric mobile response teams with no officer, no guns, no law enforcement. I was honored when Council of State Governments came to me and asked me to present with these esteemed panelists, and it's nice to be back.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, panelists. I'd like to take this time now to introduce and welcome Chief Moon. So welcome and thank you, Chief Moon. The legacy and impact that Freedom House Ambulance Service has had on the lives of all Americans is impossible to capture in our short time today. It's truly astonishing to think that 50 years ago, you and other young Black men in Pittsburgh became the first paramedics, and that the word paramedic wasn't even a thing until you came on the scene. As Kevin Hazard wrote in American Sirens, they didn't fail, they succeeded wildly. Paramedicine, as they practiced it, invented it, worked, it saved lives. It was the rare innovation and intuitive and obvious that in hindsight, no one could imagine or even remember a life without it. You responded with care and compassion for decades, Chief Moon. As we look at moving community response into the first response landscape, we cannot continue to overlook the work that came before us, specifically the work of Freedom House. We are grateful for the lasting impact and legacy that you have, and we're thrilled to have you here today.
Thank you so much. It's an honor and privilege to be before you. And actually, you all are fulfilling the desires of my heart. And it's to make sure that the history of EMS as we see it today, that we oftentimes take for granted, that's glorified on television, the foundation of it rests with a group of Black men in a neglected, underserved neighborhood that, according to society standards, we would not have amounted to anything. And as I often talk about this, I often think that society made one mistake, is that society didn't tell us that. So we went about creating a system that's copied across the country, if not the world today, in an effort to bring EMS or medical care to an underserved neighborhood. We, at that time, had to rely solely on the police. The police themselves, as well as the entire city, but in the Hill District entirely, we had I would call somewhat adversarial relationship with the police. So if they showed up, they did. If they didn't want to come, they didn't come. They took their time getting there. And so oftentimes, if you could imagine a police wagon pulling up to your residence and two officers getting out, they were predominantly white males at that time. There was no such thing as diversity. And they would place you in the back on a canvas cot, and both officers would get up front, and away to the emergency room you went. And if something happened to you in the back, maybe you stopped breathing or your heart stopped beating, you were oftentimes worse off then than when you they initially picked you up. So if you take that, and with the relationship that the community had with the police, it was somewhat what I would call a very tenuous relationship, and a disaster waiting to happen. And during that time, unfortunately, jobs were scarce, housing was somewhat scarce, as well as racism started rearing its ugly head on a continuous basis. So Freedom House itself, which was a nonprofit organization, decided to try and improve the conditions of the residents of the Hill District. The organization itself had it within it job placement, job training. There was also a mini food bank located in there, as well as voter registration. And during that time, the board of directors came together to discuss some of the problems within the neighborhood. You had residents that couldn't get back and forth to their doctor's appointments and things like that. And one of the board of directors just simply mentioned that if this organization can deliver food to the residents of this neglected, underserved neighborhood, why can't they deliver medical care? And at that time, it was a great idea, but they didn't know how to put it into operation. So they met with the local hospital, who introduced them to a gentleman by the name of Dr. Peter Saffer, who was chairman of the critical care medicine department as well as the anesthesia department. And at that time, he was in his own mindset that he was trying to prove to the world that it's not how fast you get them to the emergency room, but what's being done for them before they get there. And he was having a lot of trouble getting that concept, that idea out to the general public. And up comes this group from Freedom House with their concerns about the community, and they kind of put their ideas together. And Freedom House needed its people to be trained. Dr. Saffer wanted to get his vision out to the world, if not the country. So they agreed on a training program. And Freedom House had one stipulation, that every person that was trained at that particular time had to be Black. And he agreed upon that. So you take roughly about 25 Black men and you place them into a training program, the most intensive program that had ever been done. We spent time in the emergency room, the intensive care unit, the operating room, the obstetrics, spending time with the cardiac care unit, the IV team. We even spent time in the county morgue undergoing anatomy and physiology. And during that time, once all that training was roughly about 300 hours back then, once it was completed, you place these individuals in a vehicle that we also had to design to make it operational for the skills that we had. Oftentimes I think about the seat at the head of the patient in the back of an ambulance. We designed that seat. The onboard suction unit, the oxygen unit, the BP cuff, basically all of those things we helped design. That is the normal things in every ambulance that you see around the country today. We were the very first to transmit an EKG strip from the field into the emergency room so we could kind of confer with the physician as to what they were seeing versus what we were seeing. It's interesting because I often use this as an example. The world right now is in this opioid crisis, and the drug of choice to treat that is Narcan. Everyone has it. Police have it, first responders have it. Sometimes the addicts themselves have it. You can buy it over the counter. So we have this wonder drug that's treating opioid overdoses. But what people fail to realize or don't know is that we gave Narcan back in 1973. We were the very first to take it out of the hospital, out of the operating room, and use it for heroin overdoses in the field. There was no such thing as fentanyl back then. So we treated heroin overdoses with Narcan. I'm the very first person in this country to do a tracheal intubation in the field. I did it in the operating room of Presbyterian Hospital. And it was a challenge at that time because when I was summoned to the operating room to just get there, I didn't know why I was going. I met with the head of the department and we entered the operating room. Everything stopped. The surgeon who was ready to operate on the patient, he stopped what he was doing, and the OR technicians and the anesthetist sitting at the head of the patient. They had amphitheaters back then, and so everyone was peering down, looking at John Moon. And what I found out is that the only time they seen someone that looked like me come into an operating room was with a mop and a bucket. But I didn't have that. So the head of the department and myself walked over to the head of the patient who had been anesthetized, and they weren't breathing. And he told the anesthesiologist to get up and said, "You sit down and intubate the patient." And I knew all these people were there, but I didn't see them at the time. And I went head on and intubated the patient on the very first time. And failure was not an option at that time. Had I failed that procedure or that skill, there's a great chance that paramedics would not have been doing it today. So from that time on, we went from room to room, intubating unsuspecting patients. And little did I know, less than a week later, I would take that same skill from the operating room out into the field and do it in a person's home. Something that had never been done before. And, you know, fortunately, unfortunately, that met with its own set of challenges because the emergency rooms were not adapt to what we were doing. They were not accustomed to someone coming in with an IV or me telling you what the heart rhythm was or the blood pressure or what kind of medications I'd given him. So when we walked into the ER with the intubated patient, I was challenged by the physician as to who did it. And I told him I did. And he said, "And you are?" "I'm John Moon from Freedom House Ambulance Service. And who told you to do this?" I said, "Our medical director, Dr. Nancy Caroline." There was no such thing as medical directors back then. So fortunately for me at that time, there was a nurse who happened to be in the emergency room, was aware of some of the things that we were doing, and she kind of politely spoke to the physician. But doing the things that we were doing, we had to also train not only the community, because the mindset was that you come and get them and take them to the emergency room. No one thought about bringing the emergency room to the person. So we had to train the community as well as the local emergency rooms on what to do when we came in with a patient that already was prepared for them. And that in itself was a problem because they laughed because they weren't prepared for something like that to occur. And unfortunately, that was one of the many challenges that we had. Unknowing to us, we were creating something in a city that had never been done before. So what you have here is a community that's receiving better medical care than the entire city. And unfortunately, some of your affluent neighborhoods were not accustomed to that happening. So they challenged the political powers at that time. How dare you allow this rundown, neglected neighborhood have better medical care than I do? I pay your salary. I perhaps voted for you. I contributed to your campaign. So they voiced their concerns to the mayor. So he had to bow to the wishes of his constituents at that time. And when he did, there was no room in his plans for an entity such as Freedom House. But he had to find a way to dissolve the service. He couldn't just say, you're no longer in existence. So what he did is he went about it in a very systematic way. If you could imagine today an ambulance being called to an emergency and not being allowed to use its lights and sirens, which impacted its response times. That was an executive order from the mayor. In addition to that, Freedom House had a written contract with the city of Pittsburgh to provide pre-hospital care to the business district. And we depended on the payments of that contract in a timely fashion because it impacted our payroll. So if you could imagine, we were accustomed to getting maybe $50,000 every January, and that was the norm at that time. It was a lot of money. Maybe I'll give you $10,000 this month. Maybe 3 months later, I'll give you $5,000. And 2 months after that, you'll get another $10,000. So that impacted our payroll. And in doing that, it made it somewhat problematic for Freedom House to continue to exist, where we were forced to reach out to different foundations for financial backing. And all while this was going on, behind the scenes, the mayor had selected an individual to create its own EMS system. And it was strategically done because they went outside of the city of Pittsburgh to the suburbs and brought in an all-white EMS system. And unfortunately, they came into the city with a stereotypical mindset that this was the worst place in the world to come into. It was the most dangerous place in the world to come into. They experienced culture shock. They were even taught that, unfortunately, you're not going to get a medical call in, say, your public housing complex. The only type of call you would get there would be perhaps a shooting or domestic violence or a drug overdose. If you wanted a medical call, perhaps that would only happen in some of your affluent neighborhoods. So the individual paramedics were actually trained to think in that mindset. So if you take that and try to merge it with the mindset of Freedom House, who took everyone, then you have an unbalanced system there. So you have to try and balance it. So what Pittsburgh EMS did at the time is we had a contract with the city that said Pittsburgh EMS would take its personnel, it would take its equipment, and we would not have to go through any additional training, and we would just merge into their system. But unfortunately, the city backed out of that deal. They reneged on it. And as I'm sitting here talking to you, I don't want anyone to think that you're listening to a disgruntled former assistant chief of Pittsburgh EMS. I still love the department. I love the people that work there, and it will always have a special place in my heart. But we're talking about different times now. So what Pittsburgh EMS did at that time is instituted a systematic way of eliminating as many of Freedom House's employees as they possibly could. And it was very, very successful. And I'm talking about roughly about 80% of the people that were at Freedom House were subsequently terminated. And the theory behind that is if you get rid of the people that made history, you essentially get rid of that history that they made. And that was the overall intent purpose. So oftentimes when I talk to individuals and no one has heard of Freedom House, and even though it disappoints me and it saddens me to a point, I understand the reasons why, because there was an intent, reason to do that. I even, being the first person to do a tracheal intubation outside of the field, was still placed in that select group of trying to get rid of him. Despite all of my training and skills, none of it was accepted. I was more or less a third person on a two-person crew. I couldn't examine the patient. I couldn't talk on the radio. I couldn't drive the vehicle. I was just an observer. And as fate would have it, we went into a person's home, and the crew that I was working with didn't know what to do. They panicked. And they looked at the person who wasn't allowed to do anything and said, "You take over." So once I started assigning responsibilities to the other two crew members, we subsequently saved the person's life. And that was great, but it had to be kept quiet because I wasn't allowed to do anything. And during that time, I had to make a decision. Do I stay the passive individual that the department wanted me to be, or do I become somewhat more assertive? And I decided to do the latter. I became more vocal, more aggressive, more assertive, more outspoken on patient treatment and things like that. And I wanted the department to know exactly who John Moon was. And fortunately for me, it worked out very well. And I started getting promotions within the department. And as I started going up to the higher ranks, I noticed that the department remained steadily white. And the department went 10 years without hiring an African American. And I, at that time, voiced my concerns about that, to the point that I was able to get my superiors to listen. And it was explained to me, it's your idea, you find out how to make it work. So I designed the very first diversity recruitment program in the history of the city of Pittsburgh. And it was very, very successful. It became the norm that Pittsburgh EMS utilized to hire. And that went on for almost 10 or 12 years. And what we did is I went out into the community and I recruited individuals that had no concept as to what a paramedic was, no concept as to what an EMT was, and placed them into a training program and paid them a stipend to go through the training. And once they were completed, that moved them to the next level. And they subsequently were guaranteed jobs because the department as a whole invested into them as a career. And that became the normal way of hiring until subsequently the troublemaker left, and then the department went back to its normal way of hiring. And unfortunately, now Pittsburgh EMS has a somewhat dismal diversity rate. And fortunately for me, we, after 48 years, have just hired its first African-American chief, which is a Black female. And she's someone I hired during my diversity recruitment process 25 years ago. And she's the crowning moment of my career at Pittsburgh EMS. And I'm very, very proud of her because I mentored her all the way up to the position that she's in now. And, you know, she started out as an emergency medical technician and then moved to the paramedic ranks and then moved to a crew chief and a supervisor, or then assistant chief and then a deputy chief. And now she's chief of the department. No one in the history of Pittsburgh EMS has ever followed that chain up the ladder to become head of the department. And it took us 49 years, but we finally got it right. And she today will be the first to let you know, except for the shoulders of the people who work with Freedom House, she would not be there. So as a result, I look back and say all of the issues and concerns and problems and disappointments and setbacks that we went through at Freedom House when I overall look at her, I can't help but think that it was all worth it, because that was the end result.
Thank
So-
you, Chief Moon. Wow, I mean, that's the note to end on for a minute. Thank you so much for sharing with everyone that the story and the trajectory. And I think there's so many aha moments that, like, I know that there are people that are saying they were using Narcan back then. Like, what? Like, people that are saying the Freedom House was the folks that decided that there was going to be a paramedic or EMT that sat by the patient in the rig. So many moments there. And I know that I personally could sit here and listen to you talk all day long. But I'm going to turn our focus a little bit, and you're going to stay with us, right, Chief Moon?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, stay with us.
Absolutely.
I'm going to turn our focus back to our panel. And one of the things that the commission worked on over their 6-month period was creating a vision. So a vision for where this work is going to go. And that vision is to integrate community responders as professional partners in the first response landscape. And so my first question is to you, Chief Holloway. So as a chief of police and being a traditional responder and being in the 911 system for, I think you said 39 years, how does it feel to you opening up this traditional first response landscape to community responders as a police professional?
Well, like I said earlier, been doing this for 39 years, and that the background is after the killing of Mr. Floyd in May, excuse me, of 2020. We started having community conversations, and we started looking at what is the response for 911, and this kept going back and forth. That somehow 411 became 911. Everybody called the police department for everything, and the police department thought they had to take on all these responsibilities. But as you get out more listening to this group, then we finally realized that, you know what, we don't have to do that. It's okay to give back to the professionals. Even though our law enforcement officers go through CIT training, they're not professionals at that. And you need to bring on the professionals that can do that. So we started a program here called Community Assistant Life Liaison. And that's where our social workers and our clinical people, they go out to the non-criminal calls, taking that away from law enforcement, because the only thing we're bringing is a badge and a gun and an officer that has about a 40-hour training. Well, why not bring everyone there? And I think as we sat down and talked to the community, with law enforcement community, we sat down, we figured out what calls we're going to go to. But the biggest thing came out again with 911 was, well, police should do that, and this group should do this. And Dr. Nelson gave us that aha moment. He says, why can't we do this and that? And that's when the city said, okay, we're going to fund both. And we have done that. So we have our civilians, we call them our navigators. They work from 6 a.m. until 3 a.m. and they handle all our non-criminal calls. And I guess I would say my second aha moment was that you had to build that trust. And they also responded to a call where a gentleman was there, would say he was going to kill someone, he had a knife. And everybody was talking about how we're going to call the SWAT team, how we're going to prepare for everything. And you're making all these phone calls. And here comes the navigator that gets out of his car. You got 30 officers surrounding this guy. The navigator starts talking to the guy, get him in the car, and drives off. Now, police response was how we're going to use force. And this guy taught us how to use his voice and how to talk the person down. So that's what we need. And that's how you got to keep integrating that. A lot of police chiefs and a lot of sheriffs are still kind of nervous about that. But as we go around the country, we talk to people, I tell them it's okay. It's okay to give that hat back to the professionals. Because the type of calls we get here, we don't really need those calls. And those calls do come through 911. My child won't go to school. My child is acting up. One of my family members going through a mental crisis. You need a professional, because the key word is they're going through a crisis. They don't need a badge and a gun. They need someone to help navigate them through the system so they can get the help that they need. So again, by using our call program and by looking at 911 calls, instead of, you got to really break it down. You got to say, what's a criminal call and what's a non-criminal call? And those non-criminal calls, you don't need that badge and a gun. You need a professional to help that person that's going through their crisis, help them get back on track so they can start their lives the right way without trying to take a life. And again, you have to keep going back and forth with the community, with law enforcement to make it work. I can tell you here, my department, my unit's already told me, if we try getting rid of this program, they would file a grievance because they want that program to stay. So let's think about how law enforcement have done a 180 now, that they know that the professionals, and they need professionals here. So 911 can be changed. It takes people like this committee, which I'm glad I'm part of, to work with the other side, because there's so much experience and knowledge that can be brought into law enforcement, and they can do it much better than we can do it. And I'll end right there, and I'll turn it to Annie.
Well, thank you, Chief Holloway. That was fantastic. I'm going to switch gears and ask Reverend Boyer and follow up with Carlos on our next question. So Reverend Boyer, you're part of this commission, obviously, but also have just been known to bring groups together, people together to really move policy change and really to respond to community needs. So how do you determine, so if you're an audience member of this webinar, or you're talking to someone that wants to make a change in their community, who needs to be at the table, and how do you get them there? And how do you keep them there?
Yeah, I mean, I actually appreciate Chief Holloway's remarks, because I think it really feeds into my response to this question. Most importantly, right at the table needs to be folks most impacted by the current system that we have, right? And then you also need system players, because you can't change this structure without all of these entities at play, because also as you have civilians in this space, they too become vulnerable if you're not working with law enforcement, you're not working with city officials. But that also brings tension. Chief Holloway said it best. I think oftentimes the initial response from law enforcement and a lot of public officials is, what are we doing here? And this shouldn't be done. I'll give you some examples. Also in Trenton, we have some real tensions, right? Because we're not only a community responder organization, we're also an advocacy organization. And so there's times our work has brought accountability to the police department. Right now, some organizing that we did was one of the main contributors for the Trenton Police Department being under investigation. And so there's real tensions there, right? But at the same time, and in my case, it's the work of the faith leader to see the humanity in everyone, to let that real passion be felt, and to help coalesce everyone together for the good of the community. And so I think faith leaders play a critical role as a stakeholder in all of this, in all of our contexts, to be at the table, because often we can bridge gaps between directly impacted people, public officials, law enforcement, and oftentimes bring folks together in ways that a lot of other people can't, because our work is to see the divine and the humanity in everyone, and to speak with moral clarity, right? And to challenge accountability at the same time. And also to challenge us to all be responsible for each other. This isn't something personal. This isn't about going after anybody. This is about doing best for vulnerable people, acknowledging that everyone has value. And where I'd really like to connect this with Chief Holloway, which is definitely the experience here, and I love the way that he ended this. We actually started in that place. We heard from law enforcement. One of the reasons we heard from the community, but we also heard from law enforcement. We are not equipped. Society fails people between horrible education, between divestments in communities, creates all the conditions that bring about poverty, takes away resources for mental health. And when it comes into a crisis moment, we are left there with 3 seconds to make a decision which 20 years of failures have created. And by acknowledging that we have someone very vulnerable on the other side of the police, and then we have the police who have been made vulnerable at the very same time by the systems we create. By acknowledging that humanity and that unfairness across the board, has often broken down barriers to create tables so that we can say at the end of the day, let's acknowledge we want everyone to live. We want to see the best in those that are most vulnerable. And there's a better way to do this. And that's some of the ways that we've been able to navigate keeping people at the table.
Thank you, Reverend. That was great, and I want to make sure that I compliment your response. And to do that, I have a short and a longer answer. My short answer, I want to really highlight the work that we did together as a commission and bring up 4 main principles around community engagement that we are recommending. Is ensuring that we have space for all stakeholders, build constituency by employing a multi-pronged engagement approach, ensure there's transparent communications in the decision-making process, and build trust with the communities who are most likely to be impacted by the program. And in my long answer, I'll tell you how I did that a little bit in very short, not to highlight so many confrontations we had, because there were many, but my response comes, from the government perspective as the city staff who developed MCD Compass, our community responder program. I was assigned to lead this project from day one by the mayor and deputy mayor. And the expectations were to lead a community engagement process and stand up the team as soon as possible. Very simple, right? I right away put on my community organizer hat. And the first thing I did was acknowledging that every situation, every city, every community is different. But usually, as human beings, we all react similarly to change. For example, some people may actively or passively support or be against what you're trying to change. In this case, we were trying to change the emergency response system. To me, it was extremely important to get everybody involved, to get stakeholder buy-in very early on. And I did it by creating a space for all stakeholders and be transparent with everybody about the decision-making process while managing expectations of what is feasible and what is not. Involving everyone is key. I created led a steering committee to develop the policies, protocols, and procedures of the community responder program in New Haven. The steering committee was formed by key stakeholders such as the local police chief, fire chief, 911 call center director, emergency operations director, deputy mayors. I found this to be super helpful because they own the project as much as I did. And it also empowered them to be credible messengers with their respective personnel where the change actually needed to happen. The biggest challenge with this group, believe it or not, was turnover. I went through 3 different police chiefs, 2 assistant police chiefs, and 2 assistant fire chiefs before I could launch the program. At the same time, while I was meeting with the steering committee, I was also meeting with anyone who wanted to talk about community response. I spoke with one-on-one with stakeholders. I conducted presentations. I had roundtables with community groups, local universities, service providers, clinics. We also had more than 10 focus groups tailored for people with lived experience and their families, fire and police personnel. And we also hosted 3 town hall events to gather additional input. We gathered input from stakeholders to inform different phases of the program. And it was important for us to show that their voices really matter by including what they were asking us. Our stakeholders, for instance, help us shape our request for a proposal. They helped shape the implementation plan and strategic vision of the program. Our program went from just being a plain community responder program to having 4 main goals. We deploy a crisis response team. We establish a community advisory board that can support the work. We brought together more than 50 service providers to enhance the crisis service system. In a few months, one of the projects that was highlighted as needed by the group was a crisis stabilization center. In a couple months, we're launching the first one in the state, in the city of New Haven. We also established a rigorous evaluation and rapid cycle quality improvement process for the program. And the biggest challenge overall that we found during all this engagement were labor concerns. We had to be very mindful to address these issues by involving labor, by involving the unions, making sure that we had open conversations. We constantly share data and respond to any questions or inquiries they may have about the program. Change management is not easy, but it's important that in the process, you involve everyone, even those who may not be actively supporting you, so that you can create a space to turn things around. And on the other hand, to me, it was also important to build a constituency that is engaged and at the table to be able to be a constant reminder to us public officials about expectations from the community and about what needs to be accomplished. And they push that from their end very, very well. So I hope the long and short answer was helpful here. I'm passing it on to you, Annie.
Thanks, Carlos. Super helpful. This conversation is amazing. I've got a question for Tansy and Mark around community member engagement and burnout. So we often hear like, we need to involve those that are impacted and community members and family members. I remember the first time I met you, Tansy, you were a lone advocate in a sea of service providers and people that do this for a living. And so how do you engage moms, dads, brothers, sisters, community members in this process and not burn them out along the way? So Tansy first, and then Mark, turn it over to you.
Yeah, I'm glad the question had, don't fully burn them out, because most parents are already burned out, right? One thing that this commission did extremely well was letting us know way in advance when our meetings were, like laying out, hey, we're going to meet this time every month for the next 6 months. So giving the community member and the advocate what they need up front to decide, hey, can I commit to this? And for me and for the members of my organization, we only commit when we know we can be there 10 toes down, right? It's also important for the community member to look at their own calendar and say, hey, can I do this? Is this the group that I want to be a part of? And also remember that if you say, no, I don't have time for this, know that your voice is no longer in that space. And if you do have to say no, and you can't do it, maybe recommend another person who has similar views as you. I know, so full transparency, I am very much an abolitionist. And I asked, when I was asked to be on the commission, like, are you sure you want me? Because, you have to put me in a space with law enforcement. I don't know. But I knew that I wanted to bring our side, bring the Black moms experience, bring people who are truly, in the community, on the ground, raising these children, making sure that we're doing all these things, bring our vantage point to this space. And I learned a lot in this space. I was actually able to, create some value too. But the main thing, how do you not burn out? Make sure you know what's on your plate, and also know when you can pause and take a break, because breaks are absolutely needed and they're absolutely okay, but don't quit. Come back to the work, come back to the advocacy, come back to the accountability, tap in and tap out. Your biggest motivating factor, what kind of roots me in this work and brings me back to the work, was I have a 6-year-old and a 7-year-old. And mommy committed years ago to making this a better country for them and a better world for them. And so I'm going to always show up. And as community people, I know some people are asking, like, how do communities get involved? What do we say? What do we do? Connect with people who have similar vision and values. We do not see things the same way. You will not see things the same way. And that's actually good that you don't. Connect with them if they're heading in the same direction. If they're in a whole different book, no. But if we're heading in the right direction, let's go together. So how do you avoid burnout? Look at your calendar, manage your calendar, and steward yourself well. Know that when you can tap in and be a part of these commissions, and when you need to take a step back and tap out. And so I'll pass it over to Mark.
Thank you, Tansy. So so I'd like to talk a little bit about stakeholders and advocates getting a seat at the table. And there's burnout for advocates, as I've experienced, just as much for people who do this for a living. We know that COVID changed everything. I used to have to get in my car, after work, drive downtown for an afternoon meeting with the county, do my networking, sit on the committee, make my perspective heard, drive 2 hours back to get home through traffic. I got very burned out. The only positive thing about COVID is we started using telehealth, and we started using Zoom and Teams to not have to make the drive, and that helped a lot and enabled a lot more people to be involved. What I'd say to communities is give your advocates and your stakeholders a seat at the table. Something hasn't been said today, that the reason all of you have to do what you do is because the mental health system has failed people with serious mental illness miserably. Okay, in many communities, there's not a robust outpatient system, and there's even less access to higher levels of care, acute and subacute care. And those are the people that are in crisis, and those are the people that are populating our jails, our prisons, and state hospitals with serious mental illness, or are homeless and victimized on the street, or are no longer alive. All right, that's why we're here. And that needs to be stated up front. And it is the stakeholders, it is the families, it is the moms and dads and siblings who see the gaps in the system. And when the system tries to correct itself, if we're not there, you're missing a valuable perspective of what goes right and what goes wrong. It's just not professional stakeholders. It's the community. And to Los Angeles's credit, as I said earlier, the district attorney convened the criminal justice system of the county, but she also included community stakeholders. And then in 2018, the Board of Supervisors funded an effort called Alternatives to Incarceration Initiative, and formed a work group and funded it and brought together 150 people from the community, from all various different community-based organizations. We have a robust reentry community in Los Angeles. They were brought into the conversation, even though we're talking about crisis response. NAMI was brought in. Other advocacy organizations were brought in. And everybody had a chance to weigh in and help write the document together. That was a year of work. And we met constantly through the county, both online and in person. We took those ideas and sent them to the Board of Supervisors with funding recommendations. So Los Angeles heard not just from the professional stakeholders, but also from the communities at large, affluent communities, socioeconomically poor communities, the BIPOC communities, people of color. Everybody had a seat at the table. And I think I'm really proud of the document that we drafted. And there were a lot of concerns that didn't have enough to do with mental health. And we pushed real hard to make sure that the perspectives of people with serious mental illness, severe and persistent mental illness, were front and center. You know, as an organization, we're trying to develop a deeper bench. I don't want to be a one-man criminal justice committee. I want to have a deeper bench of people who are also willing to go to meetings and make our perspective heard. And we're doing everything we can to build that in Los Angeles and within NAMI Greater Los Angeles County. And I think the other part that we did, which also came from the sequential intercept mapping process, you can't do this in a vacuum. You can't just do CIT. You can't just do a mental health court. You can't just do first response. You've got to go through the entire sequential intercept model. You've got to look at what you're doing as a county. You got to go through the mapping process and look at the resources you own, the resources you don't own, and create a budget for what, as a county, is what you need to put in place, and get to work and fund those initiatives. Thousands of people are getting help. They used to just sit in jail. You know, and also response is changing as well. Law enforcement's response is changing, which is, I think, increased the need for a non-law enforcement response. The way they take somebody with probable cause to a hospital in crisis, and how we're really not using mental health clinicians and community stakeholders enough in that process. But that's an entirely different subject, but there's so many things to think about on this, but I'll stop there in the interest of time.
Thanks, Mark. It's so true. You start working and then you see the tentacles of all the things and that you want to address. And when you look at a whole person and a whole community, it's so right. Community response is not going to be solving everything. And so, but it's hard to not follow those trails as it goes along. So Annie, our last question is for you. I know you've been doing this work for a long time. I know that, programs start and it's rainbows and unicorns, but there are oftentimes a lot of starts and stops. Carlos highlighted how many folks had turned over in New Haven when he was developing it. So how do you stick in it? How do you stay committed when barriers come up, challenges come up? How do you stick in it for the long run?
Yeah, thank you, Anne. I think, it's a pleasure to riff off what everybody's already said, but setbacks and challenges can be incredibly painful and challenging and frustrating. And, listening to John Moon and reading about his experience, we've had similar issues here in Texas and everywhere where you start something and then things fail. So it can be awful. But I think we as leaders have to be involved in the continual identification of emerging and evolving community leaders and networks. Like, we have to keep our eye and ear out for those people in informal settings who can be part of this work. And even though the vast majority of us don't live in villages anymore, if we work hard enough, we can find other like villagers, right? Like true believers. And we have to seek and empower people who are bilingual or trilingual. And what I mean by that is, like, they have to speak firefighter, or they have to speak Spanish and paramedicine, or they have to speak agriculture, or they have to speak church. Like, we have to have all those people at the table who have an open heart, and also who aren't afraid to ask anyone for anything. Like, you have to have some bravery to be in this space. And when people tell you no, you have to look at the wall and decide, like, how do I go under? How do I go over? How do I go around? Who else can help me with this? I remember somebody from 15 years ago who had, I don't know, a bicycle. Like, what is it that can get us to where we need to go? And who are those people? And you have to keep your eye out for them. And when you find them, you bring them together, and then you score some victories, right? Because victories give you momentum, and momentum gives you hope. And once you have hope, you can throw down some education. And so if you have complicated projects and you keep your eye on the prize, you can really, you can stay in the fight and overcome sort of the bureaucratic grind that really is probably what leads to burnout for most of us, not the 911 calls themselves, even though those can be very traumatic, right? It's the bureaucratic grind that gets us, I think. And then I think we have to also look at, like, okay, if something's not working, how can we pivot or retool? The name may not be the same, or but the core mission of improving first response and emergency services is the thread that continues. And so that I kind of, that's what I would say about that. And just to make sure that we don't get stale or stuck as we do this work, and keep returning to our group and ourselves and asking, how should we shift? How should we improve? What can we learn from each other? So that's what I'd say to that. Thanks.
Thanks so much. And I think everyone can see why we're so excited to be highlighting the commission, because this is 6 of the 21 members and everyone else on it is just as great as these folks too. So definitely was an amazing group to work with. And really these frequent discussions use consensus-based building efforts to identify emerging practices that are being used across the country that can help elevate and expand first response through community responder programs. So although, we had a limited time constraints and we couldn't cover every topic, we started to address some of the issues that had been identified by people in the field and this commission as areas that were critical to start discussion and start building some emerging practices for. So we are able to identify some of these emerging practices for the programming and that are, we believe, applicable to any location, any size. And the forthcoming report will have more information on this, but just to give you a preview, the practices are building and maintaining a professional identity with the community. So really making sure that the responders remain engaged and are a part of the community and reflect the community. The second piece is integrating community responder programs into the existing call centers for first response methods through scaling community responder programs with funding, and then also managing and monitoring a program's quality through data collection and use. So kind of elevating some of the key topics is just building the space for this new kind of professional area that's coming about, thinking through how they can be dispatched through traditional mechanisms as an additional response option within the community response landscape, and how to really make sure that this is funded and we have the data and information to show that these emerging practices can become, best practices someday, and that we've got good information to share on that.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone. So I think just sitting in this of what we have accomplished in the first 6 months of the commission and now the upcoming report, I'd love to ask you all, what's next? Like, you have a magic wand. What is next for this work? What is next in this space for you? Tansy, will you kick us off?
Yeah, so next for 1 and 4 is getting the right response directory into as many households and in front of as many people as possible. What I think that the commission should tackle next is, yes, we have this great report coming out this spring. Also, telling people how to create more community response teams. Also kind of painting the picture to the community of what this already looks like in practice. Showing people visuals, video clips, even animation to show them that you can do something different. It doesn't have to be the same way we've done it for the last 50, 60, 70 years. It's okay to try something different. It's okay for the community to respond to the community's needs. So a big portion of it is shifting the narrative, shifting the conversation, or who shows up when I'm in a mental health crisis, or I'm having a behavioral health crisis, or I have substance use disorder. Let people see what it looks like. So I think the commission should tackle storytelling, a lot of storytelling.
Chief Holloway?
I definitely agree with that. Our next step is to look at this report, to see what's going on around the world, see what we can do to help our program better. And as we continue to receive 911 calls, how can the officer in the community look at those calls and say, okay, is this a police officer call, or this is really something that is non-criminal, and go to the professional, so the person that's going through a crisis or dealing with a crisis can get the service that they need. So we're just going to continue to look at reports and see how we can get better with our community and with the law enforcement community.
How about you, Annie?
So I think, I have 2 things that I've been thinking about and working on related to this commission. One is that if we're sending behavioral health clinicians or people who are doing behavioral health work or substance use work, if they're going to the same call as another first responder, then they need to be designated as a first responder with all the rights and responsibilities. The other issue or area of work that I'd like to see us tackle is how can we improve rural response. The suicide rate for farmers and ranchers, veterinarians is extremely high, and we have primarily volunteer firefighting agencies in those communities, and we're not tapping in to that group. And rural calls, if you get a rural call, either as a paramedic or a behavioral health responder, what you know is that it's at its worst. It's probably more traumatic, more acute, has gone on untreated for much longer than it might have in an urban area where you have resources. And so why are we not pushing out education and skills to our rural comrades? So, thank you.
How about you, Reverend Boyer?
Yeah, so I think it's twofold. One, bouncing off of what Tansy was saying, I think for the work of the commission, it's important to normalize this for the public, because most people, your everyday people that aren't in this world aren't even thinking about this at all. And so the natural reaction is to call the police for everything. So I think a major part is just helping people in terms of reimagining what public safety looks like and what the possibilities are, and that there are models that exist. Also, in terms of the commission, I think some of what we should be looking at is sustainability models. Everything that Chief Moon says is just something that has happened, particularly in Black communities across history, whether it's the development of strong Black economically strong communities that were torn down, first through violence, but then ultimately through executive orders, redlining, right? This is something that happens again and again. My fear is that this very type of thing, if history history far too often repeats itself. And so I think this being a very strong justice model and a piece that is really about health and healing, and in many ways centers the most impacted people who really don't have the best interest of the most vulnerable in mind, can find ways to undermine it. And I know some of the most strong sustainability models is to really weave it in so that it's paid for the same way that police and other first responders are paid for today. But I also fear that if that's the main mechanism, exactly what happened to Chief Moon and Freedom House can happen here as well. So there has to be a strong funding mix that is beyond just the powers that be, because they have a strong interest oftentimes for this not to work. Lastly, salvation and social justice, our next steps, we have to help with technical support and implementation of this first responder piece in 6 cities across the state, including our very own team. So we're very excited about that.
All roads lead to New Jersey, Reverend Boyer. All roads lead to New Jersey. How about you, Mark? And then we'll end with Carlos and Chief Moon.
Born in Newark myself, Charles. So, what do we need to look at? Well, you can do the best, whether it's law enforcement or non-law enforcement response in the world. We can't forget that it doesn't mean anything if there's nowhere to go. If there's not a bed to put somebody in, whether it's a crisis stabilization unit or a crisis residential unit or an acute care, we've got to stop boarding people with serious mental illness in emergency rooms, and work on how we get those people to a designated hospital where they can get the help that they need. We're doing something in California that I think is real interesting with co-response. So and non-law enforcement responses, we're training peers to be part of that community response. Medi-Cal has a benefit. At least Medi-Cal does, at least in California. I don't know if it's nationwide, where Medi-Cal is paying for a qualified certified training program for peers to do this kind of work. So here's a funding stream where you can train your peers appropriately with an accredited training program. So before you were sending 2 clinicians out to the field as one team, now you pair them with a peer, and one team now becomes 2 teams. And you've increased the amount of capacity within the system by appropriately training peers. And I always get real concerned about peer safety and safety of the workforce. I also have to think about how we use community response if there is a law enforcement response, because the episode that's occurring is one of deep crisis. Maybe there's aggression, maybe there's potential violence. In Los Angeles now, when what we call 5150, when there's probable cause to take somebody for evaluation, law enforcement no longer wants, as a policy, no longer wants to put hands on people. Prior to 2019, they would do what they needed to do in order to detain and transport. That doesn't happen. But the problem is, if somebody was untreated and in crisis and came to the attention of law enforcement, and then law enforcement says, well, he doesn't want to go, and we're not going to force him into the van or the ambulance, so we're going to let him go, that same person is still untreated, still in crisis, and still on the street. There's a place there for the community team to take over at that point. If law enforcement has said there's no crime and there's no violence, there's no reason for us to be here as law enforcement, instead of just the whole incident sort of evaporating, that's when community teams, I think, should be able to step in, and they can walk down the street with the guy and buy him a cup of coffee and talk to him and try to see what this person needs and connect them to the services. So there's a lot of work to do in getting communities just to do this work. But for those that there's a lot of problems we find as we start to do it. How do we fix when it doesn't work as well as we want it to, and still get people to the place they need to go that's appropriate for their level of care? That cover it?
Yeah, sounds great, Mark. How about you, Carlos?
Yes, thank you. I think, everybody is saying so many things that we need. And I'll add one more thing. I think, it would be really cool to look at each state's emergency response regulations and statutes, and provide recommendations to change them with the aim to lower barriers to implement and sustain community responder programs. So for instance, in some states, mental health calls are regulated as medical emergencies. So by statute, the ambulance services need to be involved in those situations. In other situations, we have states that are not leveraging Medicaid waivers. And understanding the challenges behind those things and things that are relevant to implement and sustaining a crisis responder program, I think will go a long way, especially for small to mid-sized cities like New Haven, where we don't really have the capacity to look at these things in depth.
This has been fabulous. You all are helping craft our next iteration of commission work, this brain trust here today. So this has been fabulous. I want to spend just a final moment thanking Chief John Moon for coming today and spending time and sharing wisdom. If you have not read the book American Sirens, I highly recommend it. You can also find John Moon all over the internet when you Google his name, between PBS documentaries, the ACLU, NPR. So if you're a podcaster, a watcher, a reader, the story of Freedom House and the work of Chief John Moon is out there, and I highly recommend immersing yourself in it. Chief Moon, from doing it as a 22-year-old, doing the training, through your entire career at Pittsburgh EMS, and now this next generation, and seeing this workforce and like knocking down barriers, like having to volunteer to become a firefighter, or you have to already have the EMT. All the work you've done is just extraordinary. And do you have any final remarks for this group before we sign off?
Well, I think you all have come to a common goal here, and it's one that I cherish very dearly, primarily, and that's investing into the community in which you serve. And even though I'm not actively involved in the EMS component, I'm still working behind the scenes with Pittsburgh EMS to try to keep them encouraged to invest in the community, because that's where your allies are. And as long as we show an effort to do that, I think, and I'm relatively sure, you're going to get positive results out of that, because people will know that they're important, that you care about them, and they respond in a positive way when they experience situations like that. So I'm really trying to push Pittsburgh EMS to take a more concerted effort to invest in the community. And they'll be surprised that'll solve their diversity problem, that'll solve their manpower shortages. But unfortunately, I think EMS systems around the country are, and this is my own personal opinion, is not doing enough investment into the communities. It's easy to post a job opening on Facebook and TikTok or Talk or whatever those other social medias are. But if you don't invest in the community, those people are not going to know that they're capable of doing that. So I'm a firm believer is that exposure equals opportunity. And that's what I'm encouraging Pittsburgh EMS to do, is expose this as a career path in the community in which they serve.
Amazing. Exposure is the word we will leave on. I want to thank all of our panelists today. We really appreciate all the time that you not only put into the commission and the reports and all of the things that we've asked of you, but also sharing your wisdom today on this webinar. For folks, I know I'm supposed to make a reminder that if you're interested in receiving our newsletters and information, there should be information about that in the chat, so please sign up for that. The upcoming report will be coming out in a few weeks, so stay tuned. We're really excited to push this report out into the field and share it with you all. Any last remarks from you, Sarah?
Just thank you, everyone, for being a part of this. We appreciate it, and we hope everyone has a good afternoon. We appreciate you.